Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Dean Remy with Global Vision International. We are a language and translation localization company based here in Massachusetts. We do have operations worldwide, well over 5,000 translators, 1,500 interpreters, over 700 transcriptionists. Language and localization is what we've been about for almost 20 years. I am the global sales manager for Global Vision International, but I will not be speaking to you this morning. The presentation is really geared towards you. And so presenting this morning, we brought two of our engineers/project managers. And the first I'd like to introduce is Jocelyn. Jocelyn Lovejoy is serves a couple of different roles, but she is a project manager as well as head of regulatory and QA for us. And then Thomas is one of our project managers and supports big and small accounts, but mostly our in-house large corporate clients. And they are going to be sharing this morning on localization and really the inevitable types of things that you're going to encounter from sitting on your side of the table, be that from your home or from your corporate office, in support of the different groups that you are required to provide support for. So speaking first will be Jocelyn. Jocelyn?
Hi. You have the little clicker?
It's right up there. Oh, sorry.
Okay, so Dean gave you a little overview of who we are. Okay, everybody hear me okay? Okay. So what we're going to talk to you about today is localization, the process of localization, and the terminology around the process, to give you a little bit of a framework to understand the suggestions we're going to give to you as tech writers in the material that you produce, and Tom's giving you some details there. So I'm going to give just some overall framework, terminology, what happens behind the scenes for localization, to give you that framework. And then at the end we'll have time for questions. And actually, as we go along, if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt. The 5 P's of success. Proper planning prevents poor performance. I think we've all seen this in a lot of the larger projects that we've worked on. So that's what we're going to be talking about first with the process. Setting up your project for localization and making sure that it represents what you're trying to accomplish in terms of the end product for your client is key in making sure that it's a successful release of that product. So before we get into the process itself, you'll hear people talk about translation and localization interchangeably. Really, by definition, translation is only the translation of the text into a different language. Localization is the broader picture. What are you doing to make sure that your user manual, your software, whatever you're producing, works in a local country and is understandable by the native speakers in that country? So it's a much broader picture. Sometimes you'll hear the word internationalization, you'll hear the word globalization. But we want to talk a little bit about the broader picture, which indeed includes translation. Okay, so here's a pretty busy slide about summary, a process summary. Okay, just to make sure I'm addressing this properly, raise your hands, please. Those of you in technical writing, I assume it's most of you technical writers. Okay. Of technical writers, are you involved with the layout or the graphic design of your material? Okay, and any of you have other organizations that do that? You have a different organization that does graphic design? Okay. All right, so you have tools. And how many of you are involved with localization? Okay, so you are the key person involved with producing your collateral, making sure it works in English, I assume, target language, and any of the foreign languages that you happen to be supportive. Not only that, making sure it looks good. Well, congratulations, you wear many hats. In our world, we have a little bit more of distinction in those roles, in most cases. The translators and the reviewers, which I'm showing here in the oval boxes as well as the PDF check, those are linguists that specialize in their native language, bilingual, trilingual, however that works, whatever the options there. But they're specialists and linguists in their language, obviously, and they have certain subject matter expertise. So that is their job, that is what they focus on. In addition, there's engineers that are the tool experts or the graphic designers. Those individuals that we work with are not necessarily linguists. They are experts in the tools. They're the ones that make sure that your product, your written product, looks as it should in the target language. So there's back and forth. So this is a sample summary here, showing there's interplay between the work that's done by the translators and then the work that's done by the layout engineers to make sure that that final product will work in the local market. So just to step back a little bit, before a localization, those of you who do the whole thing, the localization package includes all of your source material, images, instructions, a visual PDF or visual representation of what you are going to produce as a final product, as well as any other requirements about items that may or may not be translated, product names. You have specific trademark tool terms that you don't want translated. Sometimes certain examples are not translated, whatever. You usually have some specific instructions for your project. So that is a whole package that comes in to the beginning of the process. Here's one of the big P's about the process, the planning. What are you trying to accomplish with your project? So when this package comes in, you have a project manager that takes a look at what the files look like, what your requirements are to best lay out the workflow, which I'm showing here, a workflow, to represent the work that you need to get done to properly localize your material. So we go through the steps: translation, review, layout. Another word for that is DTP, desktop publishing, another buzz term you may hear. Review, editing, that's another word for that. Talk a little bit more about that. And then there's that interplay back to the translator to make sure what's been localized is properly presented. Any minor tweaks to finalize the layout, and then deliver back the package. Now along the bottom, depending on your relationship with your customers in other countries, you may have a relationship that allows you to have time for an in-country review. You may not. So depending on what those relationships are, you may have a set of terminology, glossaries, and so forth that in-country team would like to provide to you, or maybe they have the resources and the time to add a step in the process to allow them to take a look at your written material before it's finalized to provide their input on style. So I'm spending a lot of time here, but the point is that the planning that takes place up front in your localization project is key, not only in making sure that the steps are done properly, but that the information that needs to be conveyed to all of the players further down the line is properly determined up front. I mean, we all know you get started on a project. Let's say we're talking about spring coming around the corner, maybe. I don't know how many of you might have a home project you want to get done. Get a few things, you get going, and you forgot something, you got to run back to Home Depot and pick something up. Well, we want to try to prevent that, because that's a very costly back step in a localization project, because you have so many players involved, and there's usually a very tight schedule. As all of you know, you probably have your backs against the wall when you have to produce collateral for your product. So localization is after you, so there's usually a pretty tight schedule there as well. So whatever you can do to plan that up front is going to make the project run that much more smoothly. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the overall picture, just to give you an idea of scope. The work for a localization project is typically divided into two main categories. The word count, which is directly related to how long it's going to take to translate something, and preparing against a TM, translation memory. Talk about that a little bit in the next slide. And then there's a layout focus, which the amount of work there is related to the number of pages, the source, the complexity of the source, whether it's something like InDesign, or if it's just a Word document, or XML, HTML, that may involve less layout, but there's usually some amount of work there, whether there's images or QA. And then I noticed, mentioned some of the other kinds of requirements about product name, if you are using part numbers, you might need to have a unique part number for a language going overseas, so that's another one of that, setting up the scope at the beginning of the project. If you're using currency in your documentation, do you want to change the currency for the local market? US, we're a little bit unique. We don't use the metric system. Do you want your units of measures to be converted? So these are all the kinds of conversations that you would really like to have up front because it's going to make your whole project smoother. And it's something to keep in mind when you're writing. And Thomas will talk a little bit more about that as well. But these are all the kinds of things that we take for granted in this country that can have an impact when we move our material to other countries. So the whole point is put the workflow together and that matches your job. And just a side note, we talk about top-down, bottom-up, whether we're working with something directly from the beginning. As technical writers in this venue, we're really talking mostly about starting from the English source and working from there. But there's other times when you might make a revision to something that already exists. So you might change your process to change something in a much more modular approach. Okay, busy slide, apologies for that, but I want to make a point about this. The translation and review process, just like when your material is written, you probably have an editor, or hopefully you have an editor, you take a look at it, or you go away from it for a couple of days and you may come back and polish it. Translation and review is the preferred way of working with the translation, meaning there are two translators working to have two sets of eyes, looking at your material, one getting the main core of the material translated, and then a review phase editing for polish, quality, consistency. The translators are provided a package. That package includes a look, the final look of your English material, so they can see how the final product looks at least in the English language, and what it will more or less look like in the target language. But they do not work in the tool environment directly. The tools that you use to write your material, the files are prepared, and the tags, however they may be, whether they're XML tags, HTML tags, are hidden from the translator so that they're presented with strings. Now this is a pretty ugly view of what a translator might see. There are other formats where you might see the source language on the left and the target language on the right, and the tags are hidden. But the point that we want to make to you today is that many of the decisions that you make when you're writing results in tags that break a segment that the translator's translated. So if you want to format something over several lines, and it looks good in English, if you're using carriage returns or other types of artifacts, layout artifacts, in your source, you're impeding the work that can be done from the translator. Because a translation needs to happen on what we call a segment. And a segment is a natural phrase. As soon as you put punctuation within a sentence that doesn't go along with what the message is or the phrase, then you're breaking up the words that the translator's working with. And in many languages, reordering the English text is paramount for the proper meaning of the target language. So you want to be able to make sure that what you're producing is going to be as effective as possible for translation. So like I said, this slide is pretty ugly, but all that the grading, those are tags. Those are tags for fonts, they're tags for color, and other kinds of things, depending on what tool. But there's usually some form of a tag that gets hidden for the translation environment. And you'll see there's, in the middle of the sentence, let's see, we've got the pointer here, right here, there's a line break right in the middle of the sentence. Okay. When it's a tag, it's a little bit easier to move that around, but depending on how you're doing that, that can really make it difficult for the translation to be done effectively. Okay, so now let's talk about layout. The layout engineers are tasked with making sure that the final product looks like the English. within certain parameters, okay? So that example I just showed you that the translator sees, the English is on the right and the French is on the left. So you'll notice right away that the French is longer, and of course the line breaks aren't necessarily going to line up. But it looks okay in French right now, assuming there's enough room down the bottom of the page. But that's what the engineers, the layout engineers are going to be looking at, to make sure that that final product works in the target language. And that's where Thomas will give you some more details about how to watch out for that. Okay, so just keep going. So now we've done that initial layout, but the layout engineers don't know if the hyphenation rules are properly applied, or if prepositions in certain languages should not appear at the end of the line, they need to appear on the following line. They don't necessarily know all those rules. They may have a few hints about that, but the best thing to do is to send that back to the translators and have them take a look at it, make sure that it looks like it looks good, and then make final changes, and then package the files together. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the process. The process could be a little bit different than that, but that's a pretty representative view of the kind of steps that are involved and the different players that are involved in the localization project. Any questions on this so far? Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Thomas. He's going to give you some details more in line with the work that you do. So thank you, and hello.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Thomas. Again, I'm the project manager. I'm dealing with you directly most of the time for a project. You send us packages, you send us PDF files. I'll deal with it, and we try to get it done. You know what you want. You need to make clear what you need. And I have to understand it. Otherwise, we are lost. If I don't understand what you want, then the project doesn't go too well. Considerations for your source text. I'm now going really back to what you're writing, your source files, your whatever you want, and that leads the question, what tools do you still need, or do you still use? FrameMaker, everybody? Anybody? InDesign, Ditta, RoboHelp, XML based. So it's across the board what you're using. So it's, again, your source text is what everybody needs. It is what you're writing. Second thing is how you're writing it, meaning segmentation, layout. And the third thing is why you're writing it. Suddenly, you're writing it for a different country. And I'll get to that in a moment as well. The main thing is help us to help you. It really is, we are the first ones, possibly, to see your manuals in a pre-final or near-final stage. And the translators are the first ones who see it as a pre-user. So they can do a QA while they're translating. If they don't understand what you're writing, then the question is, does even your English user understand what you're writing? So then also comes up the question, who is your target audience when you're writing? Here in the US, we often hear high school grade, 6th grader, or on the other hand, engineers are reading it. So the way you are writing it, the way it has to be translated. And again, that's a requirement that the translator needs to know what is the target audience for them. The main thing is, as generally, your writing is optimized usually for the US, for the English language. Suddenly, if you go into other languages, then things can go a little ballistic. It might be a little bit back to the basics, but one of the examples that we often come across is FrameMaker, InDesign, Word files. And even though, yes, there are a lot of technical writers on the other end of us, we see a lot of these things still. So it looks good in English, it doesn't work in the target language, where you suddenly have carriage returns in the middle of a sentence, or even little callouts with 2 words. Justin talked about segmentation, where we have parts of a sentence suddenly that needs to be translated based on word order in a different language. The word order suddenly changes. The example for French here is that you have machine properties, and propriété de machine, it doesn't line up. If you're using a translation memory, then the translators are forced to translate what they see. Because suddenly later, or somewhere later, machine can come up again, and you do want to have the correct translation for it. You do not want something else sitting there. It just messes up the whole process. This can be solved later on in the PDF review, where the translator actually looks at an image, at a call-out, and makes the final corrections. If you do not use that part of it, then some of your call-outs in the target language will look skewed. Another example. Again, I've been in the business for 7 years now. I've seen a lot. I haven't seen all. I'm sure you've seen more than I do. But this looks fine from the outside. Nice little table, nicely aligned. But if you turn on the characters, it suddenly is tab delimited. So again, segmentation. The translator sees the full first line. He translates each individual segment. Yes, he knows there is probably a second segment underneath that line, but he can't translate it accordingly because he has to translate what he sees. And this is a lot more difficult to clean up in a PDF review. MS Word files usually, for example, if there are no images in it, if there's no outstanding something else, usually do not necessarily go to a PDF review or to the translators to finally check it. So this might actually be overlooked, and then you suddenly have a bad translation. What usually happens with tab delimited tables, if they really are translated, is this form, where you have the normally aligned English from one to the other one, still tab delimited, but still nicely aligned. The moment you translate that little piece by piece, in target languages, it suddenly goes a lot longer. There are certain rules for certain languages. They say, okay, 0 to 10 words, and I'll come back to that later in a moment, expand by nearly 100%. If you go generally German, for example, it takes at least 30% more space. So if your manual is 100 pages, the translated manual suddenly can go to 130 pages. It's something to consider where you have to think about proper writing. And again, it's a little back to the basics where you have legacy manuals, legacy files that you've been working on over the years, and suddenly you get to the point where it's being translated, and all these things pop up, and you get the feedback from us. We do not expect you to change all your 10-year-old manuals. That is definitely not the case here. It is just something to think about going forward when you start writing new paragraphs, new segments in your whole thing, or while you're cleaning up old files. Just keeping an eye on it, knowing that eventually those things are going to be localized and translated and localized, and also for the DTP of it. A different example, conditional text, mostly used in FrameMaker, other ones, I'm sure a lot of you have used it. It's a smart way to make use of the system. FrameMaker is perfect for it. I have another example where you have tiny little things that do not work in other languages. This is the perfect example, just a small example. You change bottom to top just because of the language. Here, for Hungarian, it works. It might not always work that way. It's simple things like that might. This is out of a FrameMaker file where the nice little English plural S, you can add it to nearly anything, and it works. In the target language, it doesn't work. You probably have 2 different words for the singular or for the plural, and you can't just add a few letters to it. So the bottom part is just written out how we can show the translators multiple conditional text by color. They see it. They still try to translate one sentence the way they see it, but making it work for the translator, they have to think twice about the sentence. Again, it's making our lives easier, making sure what we deliver to you works in the end. Yes, it is a little more work on your side, but we suggest usually, And again, you can't change all your older files, but for newer files, cleaning up, make 2 full sentences out of it. It helps everybody, and it minimizes the errors that can be produced via translation. Another just basic example is when you start writing, you start rewriting, you're changing formatting, you're changing bold, italic, underline, you change it back, you add something, you copy something from somewhere else, and suddenly, again, the translator sees all these little tags in the text. The image that Justin showed you, the little busy part, they have to make sure that the tool forces them to count tags in the correct order. So they have to make sure that either if they're leaving out something, they know that they're leaving out something, or they have to copy every single bit of it, to the point where they have, that's the little pointer, picks, different text in one word. Translators usually are smart. They might just put those tags at the end of the word, put them together so they do not interrupt the word, and you see the whole translated word in it. But again, it is something going forward, cleaning up files. Another example, just out of the blue, it is in a Word file where we have kerning and scaling, where we suddenly have a single word that looks fine in MS Word is interrupted by every single letter by 2 tags, beginning and end. It's a mess. The translators really, you can't even see the word anymore if you use that environment. It really is, we can go back, we probably have to clean up something, or the translator has to see via the PDF what the text is. And again, I see some people smiling at it, they've seen it, even in the English ones. It sounds, well, again, you're looking at it in the English way, you're looking at the pre-final way, we're looking down at the pretty little details on that part because we are working outside the environment. We are working in a basic text editor, generally speaking. So we see those things and have to make sure that these are applied. Because if you want to have something bold in your source language, you want to make sure that that segment is bold in the target language. That's the whole part of the translation. You want to emphasize something. A nice one, a last one on these examples. XML, this is where a lot of things are moving and should be moving, because I'll also come back to that in a moment as a single source. XML provides you variables, where you can interject something, change it somewhere else, and it puts back in. It's a basic example, the blue car. You can change the car to an omnibus, to a truck, to whatever you want, whatever the context needs. Or it's a product name, and you change the product name. HP printer, Canon printer, and you just have a variable printer. A, the translator needs to know what is being placed there in the variable, and B, he has to guess, he or she has to guess what is the gender of it, in this example. French has 2 genders, German has 3 genders. Hungarian doesn't even have articles. They add letters, or even the Scandinavian, they add letters to the word to make sure it's a different case. It's singular or plural, genitive, dative, whatever you want. So without knowing that, a translator, again, is sort of lost or has to guess if you do not know what to provide with that answer. Second part of this is the word order. If the translator doesn't know what is being replaced there, again, they are taking a best guess. For French, it's le, the male form, and then suddenly blue out of somewhere, and the car from somewhere. That the car is female changes the article, and it changes the placement of the adjective. French is an example where you have an adjective. Several adjectives, if placed before a word or after a word, have a different meaning. So suddenly, not knowing what is going to be placed there makes it difficult. Again, thinking about your files being translated, keep it simple. These are general layout and recommendations, just sort of, yeah, of course.
I'm just curious, can you go back to that previous slide?
Yeah.
So what do you recommend we do in those cases?
If you have one word placed there, or you know what you're going to place there, let us know. Well, we usually ask. The translators are forced to ask us. If they do not understand anything, they will ask us, we will ask you. It goes directly from the PM back to you. It's not translation on our side, it's not a black box. We are trying to work with the technical writer constantly throughout the project, letting them know where we are, getting them involved still. They see something that pops up with a question, but again, we ask you. We ask you what is being put there.
So in anticipation, as we're preparing our source files for translation, for localization, excuse me, it would be a best practice to give, here are the variables and here are the values that may come in combination.
Yeah, to a certain point, yes.
Okay.
If the translator at least sees that and can make the best possible option for it.
Okay.
Of course.